Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The City Hall surveillance list, news from the legislature, and much more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by Burnell Smith, new Tri-State Defender. Thanks for being here again.
Glad to be back.
And Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. Once again, we're doing a roundtable. There's been a whole lot going on here in Memphis and here up in Nashville. I spent three days or so up at the legislature. But we'll start with what people are calling, Bill, a surveillance list, a blacklist. What is this list of some 80 people who are being monitored when they go in City Hall? There's a lot of confusion. There's a lawsuit now. Walk us through what's going on.
All right. There is a list at City Hall of 81 people who, if they come to City Hall for any reason, the police look at that list, the police who are at the entrance to City Hall, and if your name is on that list, then you cannot go anywhere in City Hall without a uniformed police officer escorting you. The Commercial Appeal filed a open records request to get the list after several of us had heard from some folks who have been involved in the demonstrations we've had over the last year that this was happening. And all of those people who were talking to us were on the list. Some of the people on the list appear to have been on there for legitimate security reasons for quite some time. But most of the people on that list seem to have been involved in the demonstrations that we've had in the last year or so around various causes, from Black Lives Matter to the Greens Ward, even to the people who were involved in the Valero pipeline protest. Right. 14 people who were involved in that protest. The day after the protest, the Memphis police added their name to the City Hall list.
And Burnell, you said the Fight for 15, which was the $15 minimum wage, people who were protesting and trying to raise some issues about that. Some of them ended up.
Yeah, some of them ended up on the list. Folks that were in front of Graceland, folks that showed up at the mayor's house at the beginning of the year. I mean, the interesting thing is that they've discovered that the city of Memphis purchased a piece of software for about $10,000 that has literally sort of tracked many of these individuals' social media postings. And so, that is in violation of I think a 1978 order, which basically, prohibited sort of tracking people for political reasons and then retaliating against them. And so the suit, I think, is relative to, sort of that tracking and retaliation.
Yeah, and the suit is filed in federal court, and it goes back that there's this violation. You covered the 1978 as a child. You covered the
Not quite.
the 1978. Tell us the backstory of that, because clearly there was no social media back then. There was tracking of a different kind, and why that consent order is 40 years later still in place.
This is all moving pretty fast. The lawsuit for the immediate list what was filed on Wednesday in Memphis Federal Court. All right, it alleges that with this list and the surveillance that it's alleged the police department has done on these protesters, that it violates a 1978 consent decree in Memphis Federal Court. The consent decree was over a unit of the police department known as the Domestic Intelligence Unit that had existed at least during the protest of the 1960s. In the mid-1970s, a former University of Memphis student named Eric Carter, who had been involved in some Vietnam War protests here, went to the police department, as a lot of people did during the Watergate era and the revelations that the FBI had been spying on a lot of people. Carter went to the police department and said, if you have a file on me, I want to see it. The police department said, you're not going to get the file. That precipitated the lawsuit in federal court and a consent decree that the police department agreed to, which said in effect that it would not videotape, surveil, or in any other way track the movements of anyone in Memphis engaged in political activism, anything like that. The police department signed off on that. The allegation in the lawsuit, the attorney on the lawsuit, by the way, is Bruce Kramer, who was one of the attorneys who sued the city in 1978 and actually signed the consent decree.
Right.
And the allegation in the lawsuit is that the city has violated that consent decree, which is still in effect.
And part of what's, I mean, there's the legalities of this. There's also the confusion. You've got Strickland saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, and I didn't bring my notes up on this part of it, but that he signed part of the list. Right. He signed part of it after there was the die-in protest on his home and his property, which he was very annoyed by and frustrated by. But also so that's one part. There's this confusion. Well, who's on the list? Yeah, help me, Bill.
Actually, to be specific about it, Mayor Strickland signed 4 separate lists that were what is called an authorization. And it was, I don't want these people on my property. And his property, in that case, was his home.
Okay.
Now, there were about 30 names on the list. There were, at the most, about a dozen people involved in the die-in on the front lawn of his house, and he says some were looking in the window too. He says that he went to the police department and said, look, I know what you're talking about now in terms of maybe beefing up security. They said, great, do this authorization on your property that says these people can't trespass at your home. And he said, okay, you come up with the names on the list and I'll sign it. They came up with the names. He signed it. He says he doesn't know how they came up with all of the names.
Yeah.
And then he says, the next thing I know, this list goes public, and I discovered that the people who were on the list for my home are now on the list for City Hall.
Right. And so all this, there's this murkiness about it, which I think that's disturbing to people, because no one would say that, look, if you've got a person who's got a history of mental illness and violence and so on, and I don't know that any of these people are, there are appropriate lists for people who shouldn't be wandering around City Hall alone, right? But no one's saying these people are intellectually opposed to you or something.
These folks have basically done peaceful demonstrations in most cases. They haven't shown any propensity for violence or or being just overtly mentally disturbed or any kind of way. So how the list was developed, the information that went into it. I mean, I think there's a lot of questions that have to be answered, and I think most of them will probably be answered in a court of law. If this lawsuit continues down the road, because that it just who actually determined the list? What individuals went into it? What did the mayor? Did the mayor know that outside of the situation at his home? And I can understand someone saying, "Hey, I want to protect my family and my home," but then when it comes down to public places such as City Hall, et cetera, then you're crossing the line into another space.
And we're also in this phase, from really, I mean, in recent years, for me, it's been the Tea Party movement, which was in part a reaction to Obamacare and Obama's presidency, then the Black Lives Matter movement. Now we've got protests in favor of the Affordable Care Act around the country. Kustoff was in town. David Kustoff, one of the local U.S. reps, was in town. There were not protesters, but there was a potential that there would be protesters. We're in a protest phase in various ways from different sides. Protests at the Capitol this week that very much frustrated certain, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So I guess the rules have to be a little bit more established, I think, is part of the lesson in this, how you balance safety, security. We are a country of tremendous, horrific mass shootings and terrible things happening, but we're also a country of free speech. So it's interesting to see people struggle with this.
But here's the thing. Michael Rawlings, who's the police director, a lot of this falls with him and what he says happened, and he's reviewing the list. And he will not say how people's names were put on the list. He has denied that the police department did what has been termed political surveillance, and I think what we're going to find is that he's parsing his words there, because he's also said, I have an obligation to public safety. And I think in his mind, he's making a distinction between following people, videotaping them for what he defines as public safety versus for their political views. Well, the lawsuit, I think, is going to point out that it's a distinction that has no meaning.
Right, no merit, and because you've had people like Paul Garner who's been very clear about times when he's been followed. Mid-South Peace and Justice. You have a number of the other, and the interesting thing is it has not been necessarily about race. Which I think was somehow interjected into this at some point, but it's really been a number of individuals who have voiced opposition to a number of things that have gone on in the city, and particularly have voiced opposition to this particular mayoral administration. And I think that's where things begin to get real murky.
And there is evidence that police have been doing this. I mean, in following the uptick in protest in the last year, all of us in the news media, I think, have been hearing things. So you show up someplace to see if there's a protest there, and the police are usually there too in great numbers.
Right.
So
which gets back in part to the software that Burnell mentioned. That allows, and there's nothing illegal about that. No, I don't think anyone's. But unless it's a violation of the consent order. But the software in and of itself
is your public post.
Yeah, so it's public post. It's not that. So in and of itself, the software is not illegal. They're all kind of. I mean, we could buy it and track people if we wanted to.
Right.
But yeah, it may violate the consent order. But anyway, back to you, Bill.
But the point is that the phase of protest we're in now is a phase that is uncomfortable for a lot of people, no matter what side you are on an issue. But the right to dissent, the right to state your opinion, even if it's not a popular opinion, and even if you do it in a way that may be abrasive, but which you feel you have to get attention, that's different than public safety, and your comfort is not something that's guaranteed by the Constitution.
Right. All right. We'll move from there. I mean, obviously, a whole lot to still happen on that. But we'll move to Beale Street, and I'll start with you, Bill. What in council this week? We talked about it last week. There's again this kind of murkiness about where we're going with Beale Street and who's in charge and why a particular group was not given the contract to manage Beale. And some more information came out this week that I think maybe people hadn't fully realized.
The Memphis City Council has had 3 committee sessions now in the last 2 months on Beale Street. Basically, this started with council members saying, we hear all of these different acronyms and initials for who is running Beale Street, and we want to know how that works. And furthermore, the council wants to know why the Downtown Memphis Commission is still running day-to-day affairs on the street for 3 years running when it was supposed to be about a 6-month interim assignment.
As it found a new manager to run it. And
which was supposed to be the first job for the Beale Street Tourism Development Authority out of the box. Along the way, they've also been discussing why the Tourism Authority decided to end contract negotiations with 21 Beale Street, a group of people from Chicago and from Memphis, Memphians in Chicago, to run the street, who had emerged as basically the last man standing among 3 or 4 different proposals to do this. This week, it got real, so to speak, at council because some issues that had probably been talked about in the private contract negotiations were put out right there on the committee table in the open. One of the principals in 21 Beale had been disbarred some almost 20 years ago.
28 years ago.
Yeah, 28 years ago. And the other principal had been an owner of a Chicago nightclub where there was a stampede in maybe 10 years ago or so, in which 21 people died. Things that both of these individuals had talked about very openly and knew were going to come up in the contract negotiations. Now it's kind of all out there before the council, and the council is still talking this over. And Burnell, you were there as a tenant on Beale Street. New Tri-State Defender has offices in the Beale Street district, and you as one of the tenants there expressed your opinions about
it. And on this, you are not objective, and that's okay. But just so we say it and disclose it completely, this is a less objective issue.
Right, because clearly we've been in the midst We've been both in it and of it. And so in this particular instance, I spoke at the council meeting from our experience as a tenant, but also sort of representing a group of tenants, predominantly African American tenants who've had a less than favorable experience, not only through this transition, but through all the various transitions that have taken place pretty much over the last 4 years, from going from Elkington to and Performa to DMC, and now with the various changes with the Tourism Authority. The reality is that from our perspective, there's been a group of merchants or tenants, if you will, who've really been driving this conversation. And although the Tourism Authority is supposed to be an independent entity, they've pretty much, as we've seen it, taken their cues from the Beale Street Merchants Association. And the Merchants Association has primarily been driven by those with the preponderance of businesses, which happen to be, largely, well-heeled, white business owners on the street. And so we just felt like and I spoke to this at the council meeting, that, the process has been less than transparent. It's been less than fair. And the reality is that there's a disparity between those of us on the east, predominantly on the east end of the street, which is where the majority of the African American, tenants on the street are, and very few of us, I've never been asked or talked to about, being a part of that Merchants Association. Don't really know a whole lot about it, but very few of those businesses are represented there.
Now, would they say that, well, we're generating most of the dollars, most of the taxes, most of the traffic? I mean, the Tri-State Defender, for instance, isn't going to generate a whole lot of traffic. That's not why you're
exactly.
there.
And we're different kind of tenants. So, I may understand why we haven't been, invited to that party per se, but we still have an interest in the ongoing development of the street. And the other components of this just relate to, support and structure of deals and, just transparency with, how you build the street and build the businesses that are, a part of the fabric of the street. And a lot of it goes back to the history. And, and that's one of the things I evoked. When you look at, what Beale Street is quintessentially about, it goes back to, the Black culture and experience and music and all those things that were at one point, Beale Street was the center of commerce and social activity for the African American community. When we couldn't go on Main Street, when we couldn't go to those other places. And so to now go back and say, well, we're just, we're going to, take that, all that experience and exploit it economically and not have African Americans participating in that economic opportunity, I think is not a good reflection of anything, particularly as the city of Memphis is concerned.
And we should point out that 21 Beale is an African American partnership, which is also another element in the discussion. And in fact, 21 Beale, in making their proposal, did some focus group studies specifically on another critical piece of this discussion, and that is that despite the history of African American commerce, culture, and history that is Beale Street's contribution to the Memphis we know today, the street has a problem. The nightclubs have a problem drawing significant numbers of Black patrons to the district.
They don't.
They don't.
Yeah, they don't.
I mean, I don't think I'm telling any trade secrets there. I worked on the street for 8 years at a radio station that had its offices where the new Tri-State Defender is.
Yeah.
And it is a predominantly white crowd. It is a predominantly out-of-town tourist
Yeah,
crowd.
I mean, most of it. I mean, I remember, that people forget that. When I have family come in town and say, well, how often do you go to Beale Street? I don't. I mean, and that's not, I don't mean anything. It's just, I go to these other places. It is kind of a tourist area. Is your point, and then we'll wrap this up, but is it to say that, well, we'd like to see more African-American traffic and visiting, or is it like, what's the end goal here?
Well, I think, there's a couple of things. One is that the city of Memphis, and particularly the city council, move in a way to create to move barriers from the opportunity for transparent negotiation. So you've got this tourism authority, which essentially has not done anything that it was designed to do in the 2 years that it's been there. That needs to go away. And so that's one of the things. The other thing is that, when you look at appointing a permanent manager, then, hey, we need to move on that. And then the last thing is, relative to supporting the businesses that are on the street, particularly those of us who essentially have been sort of, and it's so complex, I won't get into all the details of our situation, but pretty much most of those businesses have been the same way. They haven't participated in the marketing, they haven't participated in any of the things that benefits most of the businesses on Beale Street. And so the goal is to really get to a point where there's equity on the street.
All right, and I should say, if people join us, like you all are a tenant there, and so just you're not objective, you don't have to be on this business as long as we disclose that. We'll move on to the legislature, and a variety of things are going on there. I did spend, as I think I mentioned, 3 days up there, and everything's about the gas tax. I talked to lobbyists, I talked to legislatures. You go in to talk about one thing, and inevitably you talking about the gas tax, or as they like to call it, the user fee. I was at a thing where Haslam joked about that. It's not a gas tax; it's a user fee. All this, the sense up there is that it's still not unlikely, but it's certainly the governor's plan is going to change. And you've got people, particularly in the House, who don't want to vote for what is a tax increase, even though every structure is that will not be new net revenue. So for every new dollar they raise in gas taxes, they are cutting and talking about cutting other taxes. But there are just, particularly in the House, a whole lot of people who don't want to vote for, are afraid to vote for any kind of increase in taxes.
Right, clearly, and a lot of those legislators have run on no new taxes. You won't, and particularly those that are in rural areas where the level of income is not there. Any incremental increase in the price of gas potentially has a real impact to families, and so I think they're going to be reluctant to support that in any significant way without some changes.
And also, you bring up the rural, and there's a lot of talk about, and we've talked about this on the show. I mean, there is a real divide in this. It seems fairly obvious, rural versus city. I mean, and the way that the deal is structured, I think 40% of the money that would come would be local option. So Memphis would be able to stay focused on Lamar Avenue and the distribution corridor. Nashville really wants to focus on mass transit, et cetera. These local areas just aren't going to get that much. So if you're a rural legislator and you want to be up there, you're not going to get a whole lot because you don't have the population, the drivers, the gasoline being sold.
You don't have the incentive to really do.
So, Bill, I don't know your thoughts on this. I mean, what you're hearing from here.
At the outset of this, Bill Haslam said that what made this the right time to raise the fuel tax, gasoline and diesel, what made this the right time was the state's $2 billion budget surplus. What's happened to him, and the reason that I think this is likely to be put off yet again, probably for next year, the last year of his term, is that legislators have looked at that $2 billion surplus and they have said, this is the exact right time to use that surplus on infrastructure as opposed to raising the gas tax.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a lot of legislators saying, hey, why are we going to raise taxes when we've got a $2 billion surplus? I was at an event, Haslam spoke, and he said, look, if you start putting, for one, and it's a thing that you can't underestimate, we're one of the only states that doesn't issue debt for roads and infrastructure. I think we're one of only 3. We're a zero debt state on that front. To his point, and there were some college university people in there, he said if you start pulling roads and infrastructure and so on out of the general fund, when we have a recession or we have a slower economy, suddenly you're choosing between roads and teacher salaries, university salaries, in the funding of the state. And so he would like to keep it in different buckets, and other people would. But it's a compelling argument that others make. Obviously, that look, you got $2 billion in the bank that is uncommitted. You can, why do we need to be raising taxes right now? The other thing that was interesting, he talked about why he brought it up now. He said, at the end of his term, he's term limited out, he said the need is huge, the state is growing, there's this huge backlog. He didn't think that the next governor, whoever it is, will propose it in their first term because it's such a controversial thing to raise taxes, so that we'd be looking at 6 years before anything significant would happen. that was interesting. He also talked a little bit about, you started to get a little of nostalgia, a little looking back on what it's like. He talked about how he's met, he thinks, with all the unofficial candidates for governor, and it was interesting in that sense. David Kustoff was in town. We'll switch real quickly with just a minute left. What did you hear from David Kustoff?
We heard that he expects there to be Medicaid block grants of some kind. The terms obviously still to be worked out. He believes that the Republican majorities have about 3 to 6 months to get on the road what they want to do legislatively. They have a quick time frame here in which to go with what they think took them to Washington.
Yeah, and I heard a lot about that up in Nashville. A whole lot of people, some high-level people saying, Republicans mostly, careful what you wish for. I mean, they wanted to overturn Obamacare. Tennessee never expanded the Medicaid expansion, but there are, 100, 200,000? There are many people using Obamacare in Tennessee. That's a tough thing to take away, a benefit that they've received. That is all the time we have. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Burnell. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week. I kicked this thing out.